let's talk about Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson, illustrated by Howard Lyon. This is a Cosmere novel set in his Cosmere. It's his secret project, one from his record-breaking Kickstarter, and it's a standalone. So if you're thinking about where to read in the Cosmere, whether you can read it depending on what else you've read, you can basically read it as a standalone. I'll comment on that a bit later. The first thing to say is that this is a genuinely gorgeous production, especially for something which I think normally will have come out to all-in production of these being $40 each or something, because I think it's $160 for 4. This is it's a gorgeous book, wonderful, sort of engraving, embossing, nice. As much as the foil was a curse for the timing, very nice foil. The illustrations are quite nice by Howard Lyon. I will get one up. It's not too spoilery. Yeah, that was when. That's before the story starts. That is our main character. That is Tress of the Emerald Sea. So this is set on a planet in the Cosmere called. This is not a meaningful spoiler. You're going to need to get over it. Lumar, and the Sandersonian gimmick is that there are a bunch of moons which drop spores, which fill up oceans. The oceans are made of spores. There is a fluidization effect due to air bursts from beneath the mantle, beneath the crust. Sorry, and there's fluidization, so you can sail these seas of spores. The spores, if you add water to them, do stuff. They are ethers, which have been mentioned occasionally elsewhere in Cosmere works. They're ethers. That's the basis of the world, and so people sit around a lot, and that's very important. But there's weird stuff, and it's quite dangerous. So these ethers can be quite dangerous because they have different effects. And what we have is Tress is going to help the boy she loves. They're teenagers, I guess they are. I don't know exactly what age they start up. They're 18 or something. Goes on an adventure to help the boy she loves. And you get kind of lots of maritime adventures. It's a maritime adventure book. It's an interesting thing, whilst also having on go Master and Commander and Ship of Magic. Lots of naval books in my life right now. The book itself, it's a mixed bag, basically. I think I haven't widely spoken about it with people. I've had a few friends. Tony, good friend of mine, really likes it. So, you're going to find different opinions on this. But I think that it was a mixed bag and sort of an odd experience in some respects reading it. And basically, the biggest thing, there's lots of good and there's some frustrating things. And the frustrating things all are nearly all located around the same nexus. And so maybe I should start there and then come to broader praise for it, because I enjoyed reading it. I thought there was lots of good to it, but it was the most frustrated or off-put I've been by a Sanderson novel. And so let me try to explain. And it might be hard in some ways because I'm going to need to be clear about what I'm saying. Basically, the biggest thing, and there's a big, high-level problem and a specific problem, and they do connect because I think they are directly connected. The high-level problem basically is to do with narrative voice. There is a narrator, a sort of third-person limited pseudo omniscient, kind of these are the events, but it's from a person's point of view rather than it's first person limited pseudo omniscient, but the first person isn't Tress, so it's someone else saying, hey, this happened. What is that? I guess is it a sort of weird crypto third person? I don't know. But yeah, so you have that, and that's an experiment that's genre, pushing this into a subgenre. This is meant to be in a subgenre, along with, say, the narrative style of The Princess Bride, or Good Omens. Those are two books he mentions that in different ways inspire his stuff. I read it and particularly thought of, amongst other people, but particularly thought of Pratchett before I saw that he said something about Good Omens. And I think that's apposite. I think there's obviously an intellectual, aesthetic influence there to do with the humour. Because it's a funny book. It's meant to be the narrative voice, not the action necessarily, but the narrative voice is meant to be funny. The characters, and most of the characters, not all, and the action are not meant to be particularly funny in themselves, except there's a whimsical fairy tale tone to the whole thing. And I think I had a few problems with this. One is that Sanderson is at his weakest when being funny, in my experience. I mulled on this a bit when reading The Lost Metal, that the Wayne sections actually worked less well for me than maybe they had before, and certainly than they do for some other people. I basically don't think Sanderson is incredibly funny. There's a degree of your mileage may vary. You know, if you're laughing at it, I can hardly know you laugh at it. But you get my point. For my experience, I'm like, this is a lot of the book, is this narrator. And it is a lot of the book, and this connects to a separate issue with the narrator, which is the narrator is very didactic. There's a lot of like, this is a lesson about life, or this is a kind of thing that we've learnt about these characters in this way. There's a lot of telling you what to think and feel, including just about life in general. It's Sanderson, and you could argue, well, no, the narrator isn't Sanderson, so even if so, I have issues. But I think there are a bunch of reasons to think that the narrator is representing Brandon's views, many of which I would agree with, some of which I probably wouldn't agree with, but it doesn't really matter. I don't mind. I can put up with my nose being put out of joint where I don't agree. But the two things are, one, they're not very well integrated. This kind of, a lot of this didactic narrator isn't very well integrated into the story and doesn't immediately serve the story or the characters in the story. And two, there is a way, and I really picked up on this in The Lost Metal too, though it is much less so in The Lost Metal than here, that I felt like the fantasy world I was being transported to was America in 2023, and because I live in an imperial outpost of America, it's called Britain, you may have heard of it. I already live in America in 2023 in terms of any TV I turn on and anything I see on the internet, and so it wasn't really a fantasy world I wanted to go to. Some people will be really into that. You know, you can hear if I'm saying this, you're like, man, I love the fact that Sanderson is kind of in this discussion, and he's really being kind of direct about things he thinks, and great, go for it. But it was not something. I don't go to my speculative fiction to go back into the arena. I go into it, in Tolkien's terms, to escape, because there is something sometimes to escape, isn't there? And so I think when you're talking about a badly integrated, not plot serving, not very funny, all of this is of course my view, please feel free to disagree, and much too on the nose narrative voice, it was constantly ripping me out of the book. I think it's a genuinely major problem. It was not a successful experiment. That is not because you cannot have an opinionated narrator. I love Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett and Brandon Sanderson probably agree on lots of things, and their views are pretty much the same. But Pratchett is much better at the same thing. There's subtlety. He's more funny. It's a lighter touch, and I think there's specifically, and I'm going to give instances of it that I do not consider material to the plot, but this iterated, not just in the narrator's voice, there's sometimes there, but in things in the world which were meant to either be funny or they were meant to be positive, in a sense. I'll explain what I mean in a second, which were deeply, I keep forgetting the word for this. What is it? Basically ripped me out of it, made me not believe in the secondary reality very much. So one, there's a gag, this is a very early on gag, but there's a gag made by the narrator, which is that, generals and leaders are often rated based on how many of their followers they kill, or they get killed. And you're like, oh, haha. It's a lower rent version of the Sharp joke. There's killing officers and there's murdering officers. Which one are you? But it's there. That's fine. It's okay, decent. But then there was a comment in the text in the story where a leader praising someone says he got this many people died under his command at this battle. And you're like, no, And everyone's like, yeah, that's really good. And you think maybe this is meant to be Discworldian, but the world isn't really meant to be Discworldian. It's not meant to be absurd. It's meant to be quite real and serious. The general tone of the world isn't like that. So the gag from the narrator works, but the gag in the world is very alienating and strange. Nobody does think that. No one has ever, in any culture on Earth, actually thought that you are a better leader the more people you get killed in battle. And so the secondary reality is torn away. There's also, and this is an item of praise, there is a book connected to this, a significant, very small but significant point of criticism that highlights really what I'm talking about. There's a great deaf character in this, a really, really good character, really well put together, really interesting thoughts about how to resolve how that character interacts in a fantasy world and how they can find more agency and feel more able to communicate with people around them. And Brandon Sanderson does credit a deaf, I don't know if she's a sensitivity reader or just a advisor, I think a sensitivity reader. You think, great, there's obviously care that's been put into this character, who is a good character, who I liked, was one of my favourite characters in the book. That's fine. There are specifically two uses of the technical term, if you know what I mean, deaf, with a capital D, to represent, I guess, essentially a modern category. Modern category in equality law and things like that. And once it's the narrator, and you could get past that, but once it is the least likely character, pretty much in the whole book, says, I went and found a deaf community, capital D, and man, do they have 21st century equality law on this planet? Is there the categories they work in? And I was thinking, imagine just everything in this book use the same terminology we do about everything. And I'm not saying of course it's a genuine attempt to be sensitive, but so I'm not complaining about the desire to be sensitive at all. But I thought, something's happened here where the wood and the trees have become confused. And that is so pervasive through the book. Tonally, the book does not know how to keep a good secondary reality going whilst combining it with the humour, let alone the fact I'm not sure the humour works very well. But that also connects to this desire to genuinely ground characters in and issues in our terms. And that's not well integrated. It's not something where it's a careful exploration of ideas that are really important to us, but in a fantasy world. It's just at points a very explicit discussion of stuff about us that happens to be in a fantasy world. Anyway, that is a lot of time to complain about stuff, some of which, as I say, very innocuous in itself. An odd use for a word, which, it is perfectly helpful and appropriate elsewhere, is not a deep offence, but it highlights this weird approach in the book. There is a lot of good to it. The biggest thing that's good about it is that this is one of the best structured Sanderson books in a while. It's better structured, certainly, than the Lost... in terms of Cosmere, don't read the other stuff, sorry. But in terms of... It's better than Lost Metal structurally. It's better than Rhythm of War structurally. It may be better than Oathbringer structurally. It basically is relatively short. It's 470 pages. For Sanderson, it's short. Basically, this just works. Structurally, it's incredibly compelling, keeps going, it's interesting, it's fun. You get from A to Z, pretty quickly, basically. Do you know what I mean? You get there, and you want to keep reading. And this was what overwhelmed my issues with the narrative voice, which, in a 1,000-page, sludgy, slow book, I might really have struggled with. Here, I was like, okay, but I want to find out what happens. This is good. It's really, really nice. It's a sign that he hasn't lost his ability to pace a book, which I think some people have certainly said over the last few Cosmere books. These aren't quite as well put together as the last one or the old ones. And it's a fair criticism. I've felt the same to some degree. This proves that he still knows how to structure a book. Very good, very compelling. The characters are, on the whole, pretty good, actually. It's hard in some ways to completely separate the layer of humour and kind of narrative, intentional narrative silliness being laid on by the narrator onto the story and onto the characters. But the characters are good. They are interesting. I'm not always sure about every single direction or point being made. I'm not sure if every character arc is brought off perfectly. But I liked Tress. I liked the other characters. I liked Fort, the deaf guy. Ulam, the cabin boy as well. There's a number of very good characters who are memorable and interesting. And he deals with in a shortish book for him. He deals with a large cast, giving everyone a scene that matters, more than one scene that matters usually. So enormous amounts of enjoyment in that, even if it's not necessarily his absolute best character work. It is very good. There's actually, I should say, there's less action than normal in a Sanderson book. One of his great strengths, I'd say, world building and action. But the action there is, I'm particularly thinking there's some stuff towards the end, but there's a few other scenes too that are just really good action. It's also, this is a reason why it may not be an appropriate standalone. I would not start someone on this book. I wouldn't say, oh, do you like a more actiony book, or would you like a novella, or would you like a more funny Pratchettian book? And then I'd recommend this for the last of those. That would seem self-evident. It's a standalone, but this is a thing I enjoyed about it. It's the most Cosmere book yet, in some respects. Possibly, by that I mean possibly in some respects, it's more Cosmere than Secret History or than Lost Metal. In some pretty meaningful ways, this is some of the most inside baseball you've ever gotten. It's not like that overwhelms the book. It's not a book about that. It is not. Stormlight 5 will really hit on that stuff. We'll go through all these things in different books. We'll get deeper and deeper. But maybe it's a weakness in some ways as well, to some people, that the world becomes less approachable the more stuff there is that's connecting you into everything else. That is a complaint some people have made. But basically, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was basically well balanced. And I think usually it was Cosmere stuff being brought in organic ways that served the plot. Or served, didn't, without undermining the plot of this book, served the wider world. Because that's one thing. You don't want stuff that is... You don't want a cameo in an already cut film of the Flash and Cyborg turning up in a completely needless scene so that you can introduce them for Justice League and waste 2 minutes when you've already cut the film down. And this doesn't do that. This stuff is all relevant, pertinent, or engaging. And it's done artfully, because usually what's happening is there's a primary purpose for a Cosmere thing happening that matters for the plot and the characters we're following. But there's a secondary fulfillment and secondary set of information coming out that you can also then enjoy. So yeah, I have big things to praise about this. I in a way, I wish that I had fewer of the things that nagged me, so I could say, oh, I didn't love all the stuff, but structurally, plot-wise, it's incredibly good. World building, I should say world building is fun. It's not as super granular and detailed as I'm thinking Stormlight particularly, but also Mistborn. But there is a good world building in terms of more the magic. The actual world itself is not as good as at least Roshar. It's a bit more vestigial, but the magic and the way the world is visualized, physically, just what it looks like, what it feels like, are both great. So yeah, great. But yeah, I wish I could emphasize all that a lot more and say, no, I wasn't constantly tripped up and I almost had the word again then. Disembodied. No, that's not the word. But yeah, I wish I wasn't constantly being de-immersed, basically. But I was. And other people's minds will vary, and they'll say they had no issue with that, or that was a good thing for them, I'm sure. But all I can say is that I suspect there are a bunch of people who will have read this and probably felt similar as well as I have. Anyway, tell me what you think. Tell me if you loved it. If you loved the stuff I've criticised, please tell me why you loved it. And make an argument for that. And yeah, whatever other thoughts you have, please share them in the comments below. Till next time.